Good morning. My text, or rather this text, I should say, addresses the final question from the workshop, and let me perhaps quote it again, which is how can Cabral's revolutionary thought and practices assist us in understanding the premises and perils of African nationalism? I twisted slightly and broaden it, if I may, to not only talk about African nationalism per se, but nationalism and national politics globally, since my perspective on Cabral is perhaps nuanced somewhat differently. And so this text then is split into essentially 4 sections. The first section is to look at Cabral under the scholarly gaze up to this point, and then to really track down the genealogy of his writings and his thoughts and the dynamics in between that, and then perhaps to look at how he viewed culture, identity, and self-determination, and then finally to provide a conclusive context in so far as how his thoughts and ideas could be applied today. And so that's the broad outline. Several works to date assess Amilcar Lopes Cabral, Luso-Africa's preeminent nationalist and thinker, who spearheaded the fight to oust Portugal from Guinea-Bissau and the adjacent islands of Cabo Verde. Some embed him in the context of this fight. A handful focuses on him almost exclusively, and a few discuss his political ideas. The perspectives they offer vary. One set sees him as a Marxist-Leninist, a hyphenated Gramscian Marxist, Africa's answers to Lenin, a revolutionary par excellence, or as good as Karl Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and others who, quote, left as a legacy of revolutionary experience, unquote. Others, persuaded by lack of reference to doctrinal tracts in his texts, seem less convinced on occasions, of his portrayal as a hardcore ideologue, and find him to be a Marxist in method, but not ideology. In other words, a socialist, a revolutionary democrat, perhaps. The resultant portrait, however, leaves Cabral fundamentally a Marxist, but with a perspective exogenous to him unchallenged. Today, Cabral is a fractal refraction of 20 or more characteristics, each competing with the other for attributive supremacy in the Marxist canon. There is evidence to suggest that Marx and Mao tussled together in a sack to really claim him. May well have influenced him. But Cabral was far more complex than that. Almost all scholars in the field acknowledge this to a degree. One or two scholars even go so far as to construct him as Africa's philosopher king, the supreme educator of the wisest sense, I'm now quoting all this, or an empiricist devoid of ideological dogmatism and rigidity. Making this type of assessment in the context of revolutionary thought. One author elects to project him as a humanist, and I shan't actually quote publicly who it is, a pragmatist, an undaunted optimist to the end, a dominant, friendly, tolerant, charismatic leader, a teacher, while another, claimed to have been a unifier of people. Those that see Cabral as a complex personality above or outside doctrinal Marxism do so as part of a discourse on the armed struggle and the diplomacy for liberation that accompanied it. These scholars focus on a specific area of his life pertinent to a given discourse. Such works attempt to encapsulate Cabral in a broader context, but are seen by critics as partially successful in capturing Cabral's essential core. These works are subsequently determined as having failed to see him outside hagiography, something that you outlined. Cabral himself saw his leadership to fight for liberty as part of a larger whole. To quote, "Nobody is indispensable," Cabral said of himself, An achievement is worthwhile to the extent that it is an achievement of many, even if one pair of hands is taken away, rather an Hegelian approach to life. Placing aside Cabral's Marxist influence on him, it could be argued that Cabral was Cabral, a complex meta-racial African, and as such, a closer look at his life and work suggests a triad governed him: external inputs, internal reflection, and reflexive action. Viewed this way, he emerges deservedly complex, intact, and with a core of his own rather than that of a Marxist derivative. No one has yet produced a full-scale, stand-alone, and up-to-date biography on him per se, much to everyone's regret. Chabal's 1980 monograph on Cabral and Chilcote's latest opus Bibliographicae notwithstanding, Paulo Freire perhaps comes nearest to the jugular, as does Mario and Dhada, describing Cabral holistically, from inside out as it were, a dialectically unified personality, a public figure internally balanced between words and actions. Indeed, Cabral saw himself this way, as an ordinary man who lived life intensely and drew from it experiences that gave him direction. His reflections informed his actions, springing forth in the end analytical responses calibrated for praxis. Cabral was immensely creative in this way, and the balance between words and actions informed his strategies throughout his both professional, personal, and political life and career. To understand the context of his experience, Cabral reflected over empirical evidence, explored viewpoints in normative discourses, and engaged in vigorous discussions and discords with friends, and these discords were pretty feisty, particularly in Lisbon and Cape Verde, with friends living a colonial reality similar to his, all of which cumulatively neutralized the toxicity of the colonial experience, mining him within. The colonial experiences, structural, environmental, racial, and creative in nature, had brought Cabral to witness poverty, drought catalyzed by asymmetric colonial agricultural policies, economic marginality, racial profiling and preferences in the Bissau civil service, abuse of the rule of law in the colonies and in the metropolis, and restrictions on creative liberties in the media and the performing arts. Furthermore, travels on professional assignments to Angola had brought him face to face with the inner workings of plantation economy, as did his travels and discussions with political activists, party officials, and networking contacts in Egypt, Guinea-Bissau, Morocco, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and the list absolutely continues. In Guinea itself, he and his team, we have already made references to it, he traveled over 60,000 kilometers, visiting 2,248 hamlets to produce a 200-page commission report evaluating the colony's agricultural demography. These experiences and encounters, reflections, and normative inputs shaped him and his thinking, which subsequently informed his strategy for national liberation from Portuguese colonialism. Cabral thus rose above his condition to serve a normative future, a call befitting the greater good above the need of the personal and the present. So what about his thoughts and his writings in context? One of Cabral's first most significant non-technical text analyzed the social structures under colonialism, which has been referred to. It was published as a seminal paper in August 1964. Cabral drew inspirations for this narrative from two sources: archival research of Portuguese colonial documents in Lisbon during his student days in the 1940s and 50s, and studies in demographic agronomy, which I mentioned earlier, undertaken during his stay in Bissau prior to the formation of his binationalist movement. Warriors at Work, a monograph on the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, give a detailed breakdown of Cabral's thinking here. And it's not, by the way, the complete record, I might add. This structural analysis highlighted Guinea-Bissau to be a tapestry of 18 social fragments, segments of fragmented dependencies, serving sectors of the colonial demography in a complex structural web. Each segment was assessed according to either its position in privilege under colonialism, or the degree of depletion of its sovereign identity, or a mixture of both. At the extreme, therefore, a segment was seen or could be seen as having been denuded of a will to create transformational change, while another segment was identified as nihilistic, unable to entertain change for a future without colonialism. The sector, according to him, was unwilling to engage in revolutionary actions driven by a goal for self-determination, or, as he called it, an individual's mastery over nature, and nature here signifying the status quo. This analysis ultimately became a blueprint for action to oust Portugal from Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde 2 years later during the mobilization drive, which, by the way, also drew on his critical readings of literary works, poetry, and drama, and his experiences as a former radio talk show host in Cabo Verde. Again, a detailed narrative on how this campaign was executed and how it entailed performance-based canvassing are to be found documented in broad strokes in Patrick Cabral's seminal work and also in Warrior's Ed work, though the latter engages in a more Cartesian perspective, sticking very close to culture of evidence while eschewing generalities lacking a documentable specificity, something that you evidently caught very quickly. In 1966, Cabral finally completed constructing a theoretical template for liberation, which distilled what he saw, what he learned in the field, as it were, and what he could draw from it. He reveals this template in the summer of that year during his visits to Cuba on the formation of the Tricontinental, a Third World Solidarity organization. The meeting was very crucial because it provided him and his organization the opportunity to solicit material support for much needed for the armed struggle. Cabral sought to attract donors in two ways. This is really where he is an intellectual and a praxeological liberator, by demonstrating the strength behind the movement and by conveying the visionary caliber of his leadership. To this end, he delivered a tightly woven presentation suggesting his movements to be solidly grounded in sound theory. This presentation, which is now been quoted, namely The Weapon of Theory, proved to be the first of several public texts outlining his thinking on the social construction of identity, culture, and liberty. 3 years later, Cabral deployed the Weapon of Theory framework to analyze the crisis that his binationalist movement faced. The analysis engendered a seldom examined 5-part study on political to economic, armed, and cultural types of resistance. Alas, those mimeographed documents are now extinct. It was this analysis that helped him and his movement tackle internal dissent and external challenges related to the armed struggle against Portugal. Discourses in this 5-part study ultimately went on to inform 2 of his subsequent and what later proved to be final texts on identity, culture, and national liberation. One text, National Liberation and Culture, was delivered on the 20th of February 1970 at Syracuse University, a year after Eduardo Mondlane's assassination. That same very text appeared in Wolfer's critical 1980 edition of Unity and Struggle. The last text, The Role of Culture in Liberation Struggle, was crafted during the summer of 1972, 6 months before his own assassination, on January the 20th, 1973, at 10:30 at night outside his home in a VW van. In his pocket were a letter he was writing to his daughter, a fountain pen, and a pair of reading glasses. I can tell you what he was writing to. The Syracuse text proved challenging to deliver. Up to this point, Cabral, like other Luso-African nationalist leaders, was unwelcome in the United States. Cabral had visited the US once before in New York in 1962 to convince the United Nations Fourth Committee to recognize the binationalist movement he was leading. The succeeding 8 years, Cabral failed to gain entry into the United States, largely because the latter's NATO-based alliance with Lisbon helped the US with its Vietnam-focused logistic needs for military facilities and bases in the Azores Island. In 1970, however, things changed. A few months before the event at Syracuse, the Vatican, which was in the throes of Vatican II and which was headed by Pope John the 23rd, recognized Cabral's movement and those led by the fellow Luso-Africans fighting for self-determination in Angola and Mozambique. Thereafter, American position on Lusophone nationalism softened. Cabral was not only granted entry to deliver the memorial lecture, but was subsequently invited to speak to the Senate hearings on Portuguese colonies. The writing was almost on the wall. Put differently, both Cabral and the text were received very well, given the circumstantial trajectory of this entry into the empire on the other side of Portugal. Now, how did he view culture, identity, and self-determination? To this point, I provided you with the genealogy and the praxis. Cabral saw culture as a process of individual and social consciousness, resulting in a dynamic synthesis. The synthesis engaged, to quote, the material and spiritual historical reality of a society or human group as a discourse, and then, quote again, between man and nature, as well as among men and among the social classes or sectors. Needless to add, he is using here, not being gender biased, but using generically speaking, given the built-in Identity, on the other hand, according to Cabral, was the affirmation or negation of characteristics by an individual along the biosocial historical continuum, unquote. For Cabral, then, identity was an informed choice with which to affirm or negate a given culture. That choice was arrived at or catalyzed through a creative force. Education, in its broadest sense, was one such creative force, as were the fine arts and performance in radio theatre. As such, this creative force played a clear, multi-dimensional role as a rectifier of deficiencies, as a builder of capacity for choosing identity, and as a tool for empirical, existential, and iterative self-realignment. How am I doing on time? 8 minutes. Sorry? 8 minutes. Whether catalyzed by forces outside or from within, public fora education was a transdisciplinary key to progress. His own early multidisciplinary forays into poetry, dramaturgy, mass media, arts and communication, and the natural sciences, agronomy inclusive, were a testament to his perspective, as was his inclination to use his colonized life as a learning process. Lifelong learning, therefore, transcended disciplinary bounds for creative self-growth. When fed by external reflexive forces, and processed internally through iterative analysis, a white could thus claim to be an African by choice, as could a black elect to be a European. Theory, that is. In practice, however, colonialism complicated the prospect of blacks as Europeans and bugged it all out. Cabral, therefore, saw colonialism as a complex shape-shifter, not a zero-sum entity dominantly developing Europe, as Walter Rodney's text would suggest. In its totality, colonialism was a force of cultural occupation in Africa. In contact with the local population, colonialism pushed, tugged, and pulled the social fabric of the subjugated, shaking it loose while driving the most susceptible to socioeconomic extremities, and the least vulnerable and the fewer in number towards a cultural and socio-economic collusive supremacy in cahoots with the empire. Assimilation policies proved singularly effective in furthering imperial interests here. They formalized entries for the assimilated into the upper margins of society, suggests Cabral, by using literacy pre-qualifiers. Colonialism therefore targeted such individuals for colonial agency, thereby inducing what we in colonies call desreinsamento, alienation through upheaval. Ultimately, with this process in place, the assimilated assumed a colonized or colonialized identity, serving Portugal as cultural occupationists. By very definition, such individuals lived both the margins of society, at the margins of their own culture, and at the fringe of the dominant colonial culture. Their impact on the majority was even more pernicious, divisive, and variegated. It is here that a return to the source must play a role in self-determination, says Cabral, a first step in their struggle to decolonize. To find themselves from within, and in the context of their own culture, such individuals, according to Cabral, must return to the source. They must re-Africanize, build a series of biosocial and historical matrices on which to begin a process of self-validation and, by linear extension, wean off colonialism. Of course, there is nothing to prevent such individuals from staying put. But to do so, is to continue the validation of a culturally occupying force, which in turn was anti-liberation, an irrational choice outside self-determining history. Were such individuals to commit, as it were, cultural suicide, however, they were not bound to construct a matrix whence they originally sprang. And that's an important point Cabral makes. They could turn to alternative sources of non-imperial culture or graft a composite. In his own case, he elected to re-Africanize, reclaiming his African roots while dermally retaining his Cape Verdean socio-biological nativity. In short, he became a binationalist. It is not surprising that Cabral came to these sets of heuristic conclusions for his own process of self-determination. In retrospect, it is clear that this process was largely dictated by two sets of experiences which I mentioned earlier in the text. The first then sprang largely from his colonial encounters, before, during, and immediately after his university days in Lisbon, before his arrival in Guinea-Bissau. And the second set emerged from his lived-in experience as a fighter leading the struggle against Portuguese colonialism. Further, it is important to point out that Cabral here is not advocating a process of individuation as used in Jungian psychology. No. He is asking that the rediscovery of the new self be part of a larger social and cultural collective. He saw individualism as a scab, residually stripping native culture of its dignity. In a sense, Cabral is therefore at odds with Senghor's idea of a validation of a dominant European colonial culture, particularly one that encourages subsumption of African social cultural realities. Once reconstructed, Cabral envisioned such de-assimilated elites to catapult to leading the party. Even here, Cabral notes with caution, this sudden rise to power was fraught with peril for the party and ultimately the nation. One such peril was nepotism. Basil Davidson, in his earlier work, chose to call it mountaintopism, that is to say, a term used by the Chinese under Mao's leadership to denote corruption and graft. Cabral was astute to recognize this as a possibility within his party, and for good reason. After all, these assimilated leaders had in the past abused power as enablers of cultural occupation under Portuguese colonialism. I'm off. Oh, 2 more minutes. Well, that's fine. He therefore, I should now go into kind of a car advertising mode. He was therefore right to suspect that this trend would infect his own party. And how he then actually sort of resolved it? He actually resolved it through a series of vigilant and public education designed to defeat sectarianism with service for the greater good. Cabral here was using his own version of mini conférence nationale, a magnavox populi, if you like, a formalized institution, a sacred space in which the people as no one negotiated conflicts and settled pressing issues of national concern as a lived-in experience under an ideological banner. The conclusive context. Can Cabral's thoughts and actions address the challenges we face in contemporary national politics in Africa and beyond? As stated in the text, Cabral's culture was a relational matrix governing humans in their natural context, a matrix openly adaptive towards an objective. Identity was an act of volition, docking one's consciousness to a culture of choice driven for a purpose. Taken together, culture and identity, when operationalized this way, drove the dynamics of self-liberation forward, and also national liberation. Of course, when such dynamics derailed from its purpose, public fora or self-determination conferences ensured that both culture and identity reoriented anew towards the struggle for liberty and the self-determination. This task of reorientation was achieved by negotiating conflicts collectively in the Claude the Fortean sense of the word. Allow me just then about one sentence, or two, or a paragraph. Put differently, the ailments festering contemporary nationalism in Africa and in general globally could benefit a great deal from Cabral's ideas as praxis. His concept of culture as a malleable force for national consciousness and national building could prove immensely popular in resolving crises in ideology, address atomized partisanship, and tackle conflicts festered by identity politics, race, and warring cultures. In advocacy to dock identity to culture as a Cartesian choice could facilitate greater consciousness for an all-inclusive social pluralism, a pluralism that celebrates diversity and acceptance. Such a stance, therefore, would render identity as an act of choice and not an inheritance dictated by accidents of birth reinforced by divisive social conditioning. His framework of national conference could well address broader national crises threatening the very fabric of constitutional politics in a global world. In a few words, then, Cabral is indeed relevant in the world in which we presently live.